Every intelligence agency in the world has a list, not a public list, not a list that gets read into a court record or debated in a parliament. A quiet list, maintained in secured servers, reviewed behind closed doors, updated whenever the calculus of threat and opportunity shifts enough to warrant it. The names on this list are not soldiers. They are not generals. They are something harder to kill and harder to replace, the people who make the violence financially possible. Khalil Mansour had been on that list for 6 years. He did not look like a man who moved money for one of the most heavily sanctioned militant organizations on earth. He looked like what he was, on the surface, a Lebanese businessman in his late 50s, slightly overweight, unremarkable in the way that very careful people learn to be unremarkable. He wore the same style of dark jacket to every meeting. He drove a domestic sedan. He paid his bills on time. His neighbors, in a quiet residential district of a Lebanese coastal city, would later describe him as polite, quiet, private. What his neighbors did not know was that the United States Treasury had sanctioned him in 2019 for allegedly funneling tens of millions of dollars from Iran's Revolutionary Guards into the operational accounts of Hamas's military wing. What they did not know was that his logistics company had served for years as a corridor through which weapons procurement funds moved from Tehran to Beirut to Gaza. What they did not know was that a weapons shipment assessed to contain components for precision-guided munitions, a shipment that intelligence traced, in part, back to financial authorizations. Mansour had helped structure, had arrived in the South 6 weeks before this story begins. And what Khalil Mansour himself did not know, on the Thursday evening he drove to the municipal stadium to watch his son play football, was that 3 people in that stadium had been sent there specifically for him. His son, Tariq, wore the number 17. He had worn it since he was 12 years old, playing youth football on a concrete pitch in a neighborhood that no longer existed in the form it had then. He was 24 now, quick on the left wing. Not quite professional, but good enough to draw a small crowd of genuine admirers to these Thursday evening fixtures. Mansour had attended every home match for 2 full seasons, 41 consecutive matches, same section, same row, same seat if it was available. He arrived 20 minutes early and left within 10 minutes of the final whistle. This is the detail that intelligence analysts flagged. Not his business meetings, which he varied carefully. Not his travel, which was irregular and difficult to predict. His son's football matches, the one fixed point in the schedule of a man who had otherwise successfully eliminated fixed points from his life. A careful man had made a human decision, and the human decision had created a seam. The operative, designated for the primary role in this account, arrived at the stadium before the gates opened. He will be referred to here as Eitan. That is not his name. Eitan was in his late 30s and had operated in the Levant long enough that Beirut felt, in some uncomfortable way, like a city he knew better than cities he had a right to know. He spoke functional Arabic with a Syrian-influenced accent, which matched the documentation he was carrying. A Syrian-born European national, in Lebanon on trade consulting business, with 3 weeks of legitimate professional activity behind him that would withstand the kind of check a Lebanese security service might run in the first 48 hours after something went wrong. He had been in the stadium 3 times before this night. Each time, a different section, a different entry gate, a different arrival time. Each time, he had spent 90 minutes watching not the match, but the man in Section C, row 11, and the men around him. What the surveillance file had told him matched what he saw on the first 2 visits. 2 bodyguards, informal but professional, local men, hired muscle, present enough to deter casual interference but not trained to the level of a close protection specialist. Entry through the north gate. Exit through the same gate, post-match. No variation. On the second visit, Eitan had found something the file hadn't told him. 3 rows behind Mansour, 2 seats to the right, a man sat through the entire match without once watching the pitch. His eyes moved across the crowd, the exits, the peripheral space around Mansour's seat. He could have been municipal security. He could have been a Hezbollah oversight presence, someone tasked with monitoring an asset rather than protecting one. He could have been a coincidence. Eitan had reported it. The response from the planning level was to proceed unless the unknown individual was assessed as a direct threat. He was not a direct threat. He was an unknown. In a clean operation, unknowns are resolved before execution. This one was not going to be. The operation had been scheduled for tonight, the following Thursday after the second visit. Because the weapons shipment had moved the timeline forward, and the committee had decided that waiting for a cleaner picture carried more risk than proceeding with the picture they had. Eitan understood the logic. He did not entirely agree with it. He had been in enough operations to know that incomplete threat mapping was not an administrative problem. It was the specific condition under which field operatives made decisions in 2 seconds that they spent years afterward examining. He found his seat. The stadium was filling around him. 2 sections away, in a position that covered the secondary exit corridor and maintained a sightline to both the unknown individual and Mansour's bodyguards, a second operative settled in. He is referred to here as Raz. 48 hours before this match, Raz had made an error. It was small, by the accounting of field operations, a route variation that brought him within recognition distance of a man he had met once, briefly, at a trade networking event 3 weeks earlier. The man had recognized him. The man had, immediately afterward, taken out a phone and appeared to make a call. The subsequent assessment had come back clean. No intelligence flags on the contact, no known affiliations. The call was assessed as unrelated, coincidental, a man making an ordinary call at an ordinary moment. Dror, the case officer monitoring from outside the stadium, had accepted that assessment. He had recommended proceeding. But Raz knew what Raz knew. He had been in the business long enough to understand that the calls that burn operations are never the ones that look suspicious. They are the ones that look like nothing, right up until the moment they turn into something. He had raised the concern once, formally, through the communication channel. The response had been clear. He had not raised it again. That was not how this worked. He sat in his seat. Kickoff was 11 minutes away. The stadium noise was building toward the particular pitch it reached just before a match began, anticipatory, communal, the sound of people briefly united by something that had nothing to do with the world outside these walls. Mansour arrived in Section C. He was carrying a cup of tea. He sat down, settled his jacket, and looked out at the pitch where his son was finishing warm-up drills. His face, at that distance, held the expression of a man at rest, and whatever calculations occupied the rest of his existence, they were not present here. Eitan clocked him at 1941. The match would begin at 20:00, and somewhere between kickoff and the first whistle of halftime, a decision was going to be made with information that was still, at this moment, incomplete, about the unknown individual in Section C, about what Raz's contact had or hadn't set in motion 48 hours ago, and about whether the operation that had been authorized, planned, and moved forward over 6 weeks was actually executable in the form the planning room had imagined. 3 rows behind Mansour, the unknown individual took his seat. He did not look at the pitch. The match began the way all matches begin, with a burst of crowd noise that rose, crested, and settled into the sustained low roar of collective attention. Eitan was not watching the match. He was watching the unknown individual in Section C, 3 rows behind Mansour, tracking the pattern of his eye movement with the peripheral focus that fieldwork trains into a person over years until it becomes something close to instinct. The man's eyes had not moved to the pitch since he sat down. They moved in a slow circuit, left side of the crowd, right side, the aisle, the exit, Mansour's back, then the circuit again. That pattern had a name in the professional literature. It was called protective surveillance, and it was not what a hired bodyguard did. Hired bodyguards watched the immediate perimeter around a principal. They watched for approach. This man was watching for observation, watching to see whether Mansour was being watched. This was a counter-surveillance layer. Eitan had suspected it on the second visit and had not been able to confirm it. He had reported the uncertainty. The assessment had come back as inconclusive, and inconclusive had been accepted as manageable. Now, 6 meters away, watching the circuit repeat for the 4th time in 11 minutes, inconclusive was no longer the right word for it. He sent a 3-character signal through the channel. In the parking structure 200 meters north of the stadium, Dror received it. The 3 characters meant reassess unknown individual, counter-surveillance profile confirmed. Dror sat with that for a moment. The operational plan had been built around 2 bodyguards. 2 bodyguards had a known geometry, known positions, known sightlines, known response patterns based on 3 weeks of observation. 2 bodyguards had been mapped, gamed, and accounted for in every execution scenario the planning room had produced. A counter-surveillance operative was a different category of problem entirely. A counter-surveillance operative was not there to respond to a threat. A counter-surveillance operative was there to identify that a threat existed before it materialized. Which meant that if this individual was performing his function correctly, the question was not whether Eitan could execute past him. The question was whether this individual had already clocked Eitan. Dror ran the calculation. Eitan had been in the stadium 3 times before tonight, always in different sections, always through different gates. Tonight, he had entered through the east gate, which he had not previously used. His seat tonight was in a section with no overlap with his previous positions. On pure tradecraft, his exposure to the counter-surveillance layer was low. But low was not 0, and the operation was already carrying Raz's networking contact as an unresolved variable. 2 unresolved variables, in a close access operation, in a country with active Hezbollah intelligence presence, was the kind of arithmetic that produced outcomes that no post-operation debrief could fully explain. He sent back a single instruction: hold, assess, await. On the pitch, Tariq Mansour received a pass on the left flank and drove toward the penalty area before being closed down and losing the ball. In Section C, row 11, Khalil Mansour leaned forward slightly, the way fathers do when their sons are close to something. He had no idea. That specific thought, he has no idea, passed through Eitan's mind and was set aside. It was not a useful thought. It was the kind of thought that fieldwork was supposed to train out of a person, and mostly it did, except in moments of stillness, when the target was close enough to be human, and the operation was suspended in uncertainty, and the mind reached for something to do with itself. Eitan returned his attention to the counter-surveillance operative. The man had shifted his position slightly. He was now angled more directly toward the east side of the stadium, the side Eitan was sitting on. The circuit of his eyes had narrowed. He was not scanning broadly anymore. He was watching a specific quadrant. Eitan did not move. Movement was the worst response. He let his eyes go to the pitch, held them there for 30 seconds, then let them drift back in the slow, directionless way of a man passively watching a crowd. Nothing deliberate. Nothing that would register as the eye movement of a person who was tracking someone. His earpiece produced 2 clicks. Dror's signal for "stand by, decision incoming." The match was in its 14th minute. 2 sections away, Raz had his own problem. He had been running a secondary check on the networking contact since the previous evening, not through official channels, which were too slow, but through a local asset who knew Beirut's commercial community well enough to do a quiet background pull in 24 hours. The result had come back 2 hours before the match. The networking contact was clean. No intelligence flags, no Hezbollah affiliations, no unusual financial activity. There was nothing in the profile that suggested the phone call after recognizing Raz had been anything other than an unrelated call at an unfortunate moment. But the local asset had added something that wasn't in the brief. The networking contact had, 3 months earlier, attended a series of business development meetings organized by a Lebanese commercial entity that intelligence had previously flagged as a front for Hezbollah financial activity. The flag was old, 2 years, and the entity had since dissolved. The contact's attendance at those meetings could mean something. It could mean nothing. People in Beirut's business community attended meetings organized by entities they knew nothing about all the time. It was that kind of city. Raz had reported it. Dror had said, "Noted." Noted. Raz sat in his seat and looked at the match and thought about what it meant to proceed with 2 variables that had each been individually assessed as low risk but had not been assessed together as a combined exposure, because no one had done that calculation, or if they had done it, they hadn't shared the result. He was not panicking. Panic was not a state he permitted himself in operational environments. But there was something underneath the controlled surface that he recognized as the specific anxiety of a professional who could see clearly that the picture was not complete and could not, from his current position, do anything about it. At minute 17, Dror made a decision. He authorized a modified execution timeline. The primary window, minutes 8 through 19 of the first half, was being extended. The team would not execute in the first half. They would hold through halftime, use the interval to reassess the counter-surveillance operative's pattern, and make a final execution decision for a window in the second half, between minutes 60 and 72. The extension added 45 minutes of exposure time for both Eitan and Raz inside the stadium. Eitan received the instruction. He acknowledged it. What he did not transmit through the channel, because it was not the kind of thing that got transmitted, was the recognition that had arrived quietly and completely in the moment he read the instruction. The operation had just changed shape. It had arrived at the stadium as one thing and was now becoming another thing, and the new thing had not been planned, had not been gamed, had not been assessed for its specific risks in the way the original plan had been. They were improvising, carefully, professionally, with the discipline of trained people, but improvising. And Khalil Mansour, in Section C, Row 11, was watching his son play football with the complete ease of a man who believed, not without reason, that his geography and his caution and his years of careful behavior had placed him beyond the reach of the people who had been trying to reach him. That belief was not entirely wrong. It was also not entirely right. At halftime, the counter-surveillance operative stood. He did not go to the concession stand. He did not use the bathroom facilities near the east exit, which was the route most of the crowd took. He walked to the north end of the stadium, stood near the railing overlooking the lower tier, and made a phone call. Eitan tracked him from his seat. The call lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. At its conclusion, the operative returned to his seat, settled in, and resumed his pattern. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. To whom and about what was entirely unknown. Dror, when Eitan reported it, was quiet for a moment before he responded. Then he said, "We need to consider abort." Raz heard it through his earpiece. The second half was 8 minutes from starting. In Section C, Row 11, Khalil Mansour had finished his tea and was looking at the pitch with the patient attention of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing else he needed, in this moment, to be doing. The phone call had lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Nobody knew what it meant. That was the problem. The second half began without resolution. Dror had not authorized abort. He had not authorized execution. He had said, "We need to consider abort." And then the channel had gone quiet for 6 minutes, while the second half kicked off, and 40,000 people resumed the noise that made this venue viable as an operational environment in the first place. Eitan sat with the silence in his earpiece and watched the counter-surveillance operative return to his pattern, the slow circuit of eyes, the narrowed quadrant on the east side, the deliberate non-engagement with the match. Whatever the 4-minute phone call had been, the operative's behavior afterward was unchanged. He had not alerted. He had not moved closer to Mansour. He had not signaled the bodyguards, which meant one of two things. Either the call was unrelated and the operative had returned to a standard rotation, or the call had been exactly what it appeared to be, and whatever it had set in motion was not visible yet. Eitan sent a single query through the channel. Dror responded after 90 seconds. Proceed to standby. Decision at 60 minutes. 12 minutes away. The incorrect assumption had been built into the plan from the beginning, and no one had caught it. The planning room had modeled Mansour's exit behavior based on 41 matches of surveillance. He left within 10 minutes of the final whistle, always through the north gate. The bodyguards flanked him, he moved to his vehicle, and he was gone. Clean, predictable, consistent. What the planning room had not accounted for, because the surveillance had never captured it, because it had never happened before, was the possibility that Mansour left early. At the 53rd minute, with the match still level, Mansour stood. Not to use the bathroom, not to get another drink. He stood with the deliberate quality of a man who has decided something, exchanged a brief word with the bodyguard on his left, and began moving toward the aisle. Eitan registered it and felt the specific coldness of a plan dissolving in real time. The 60-minute window had just become the next 90 seconds, or it became nothing. He sent the alert through the channel. 3 rapid signals, the code for target moving, unscheduled. Dror received it and made a decision in 4 seconds. He authorized execution, not the planned approach, not the 60-minute window with its mapped geometry and assessed sightlines, but now, in whatever form was available. The counter-surveillance operative was on the east side. Mansour was moving toward the north aisle. The bodyguard on his right had not yet stood. He was still seated, turned toward the pitch, apparently unaware that Mansour was already moving. There was a gap. Narrow, brief, contingent on Raz moving to the north section in the next 40 seconds to cover the exit while Eitan closed the approach from the row below. Eitan was already moving. He came down the row with the unhurried body language of a man heading to the bathroom, slightly sideways, excusing himself past seated spectators, not fast enough to draw attention, not slow enough to lose the window. The crowd noise was high. The match had produced a near chance, and the stadium had responded with the rising collective sound of almost, which was louder than a goal in its own way, every person in the building briefly leaning forward into the same shared hope. He reached the aisle. Mansour was 6 meters ahead, moving toward the north exit with the bodyguard on his left and a half-step gap on his right where the second bodyguard was still catching up. Eitan closed the distance to 4 meters. 3. At 2 meters, the bodyguard on the right materialized. Not from behind, from the side. He had not been trailing. He had anticipated Mansour's movement and taken a parallel route through the row above, and he arrived at the aisle at precisely the moment Eitan did, closing the gap on Mansour's right side with the automatic competence of a man who had done this specific movement many times. 2 meters became blocked geometry. The approach angle that the modified plan required, close right, brief contact, controlled, was no longer viable. The bodyguard's body occupied the exact position the plan needed to be empty. Eitan did not break stride. He turned the movement into a natural crowd flow, a man heading north, same direction as the small pocket of people beginning to trickle toward the exits before the final whistle. He let the distance open. He fell back to 5 meters, then 7, tracking Mansour toward the exit without closing. In his earpiece, Dror, status. Eitan sent back the single character for blocked repositioning. The north exit corridor was 30 meters long, concrete walled, narrowing toward the gate. It was the worst possible environment for what was supposed to happen: low crowd density this early in the exit, high visibility, tight geometry. The operational plan had specifically avoided the corridor for this reason. Execution in an exit corridor, with 2 bodyguards and an unresolved counter-surveillance element somewhere behind, was the scenario the planning room had called non-viable. Dror, monitoring from the parking structure with no visual on the corridor, sent the abort signal. 2 clicks in Eitan's earpiece. Stop. He stopped. He let Mansour move ahead. He watched the gray jacket and the 2 bodyguards reach the gate and passed through it into the early evening air outside. The window had lasted 40 seconds and produced nothing. This is where the false release happened, and where it became something else entirely. Outside the north gate, Mansour stopped. Not because of anything operational, because of his son. Tariq Mansour had seen his father leaving early from the pitch, the match still ongoing, and had, with the instinct of a son who knows his father's habits, jogged to the sideline nearest the north exit and called out. A brief exchange, inaudible at distance, the kind of thing that passes between fathers and sons at the end of every match in every language. Mansour stopped. He laughed at something his son said. He stepped slightly away from his bodyguards, 4 feet, maybe 5, in the way that people step away from their formal arrangements when a moment becomes briefly personal. He was exposed. Not in a corridor, not in a crowd. Outside, in the open space between the north gate and the parking approach, under lights, with his bodyguards slightly behind him and his attention on his son on the other side of a chain-link fence. Eitan was through the gate within seconds of Mansour, caught in the natural outflow of early exit spectators. He had not been recalled to position. He had not been given new instructions. He was 12 meters from Mansour, and the channel was quiet, and the geometry had just opened in a way that bore no resemblance to any scenario that had been planned. He made a decision without authorization. He sent a single signal, the code for viable, acting, and closed the distance. At 8 meters, the counter-surveillance operative came through the gate. He was moving faster than a man exiting a football match should move. Not running, not drawing attention, but fast, purposeful, the body language of someone responding to something, and his eyes went directly to Mansour, then to the space around Mansour, then, for 1 second that Eitan felt more than saw, to Eitan. Their eyes did not meet. Eitan's gaze had already moved past, but the operative had scanned him. Whether that scan had produced recognition, assessment, suspicion, there was no way to know and no time to determine it. 5 meters. The bodyguard on Mansour's left had turned back toward him. The exchange with Tariq was ending. The boy was being waved back to the pitch by a coaching assistant, the brief human interruption closing as quickly as it had opened. Mansour turned back toward his bodyguards. The 5-foot gap was contracting. Eitan was at 4 meters, then 3. The counter-surveillance operative was 6 meters behind him, and the scan was still unresolved in Eitan's mind. Had that been recognition? Had that been assessment? Was there a call being made right now to someone who was going to change everything in the next 30 seconds? And the answer was unknowable, and the window was measured not in minutes, but in the time it took for a father to say goodbye to his son and turn back to the 2 men whose job was to keep him alive. 2 meters. Mansour half turned, his eyes moving toward the parking approach. 1 meter. The parking structure was quiet. Dror sat in the vehicle he had occupied for 4 hours and did not move for 6 minutes after Eitan's exit signal came through, not because there was anything left to do inside the stadium. Because 6 minutes was the minimum interval before he could safely start the engine and move toward the extraction corridor without the movement registering as responsive to whatever was unfolding at the north gate. He had received the acting signal. He had not authorized it. That distinction was going to matter. Later, in a room he was already beginning to mentally inhabit, a debrief room, fluorescent lit, with a recorder on the table and 2 people across from him who would ask, with the measured patience of people who already knew the answer, why a field operative had executed without authorization and what that said about the command structure of the operation. He started the engine at minute 7 and moved toward the extraction point. Eitan was through the secondary exit of the parking structure before the first police vehicle arrived. He did not run. Running was the decision that burned extractions more reliably than any other single factor. He walked at the pace of a man who had somewhere to be and was not late for it, through a side street adjacent to the stadium that he had walked 3 times before tonight at 3 different times of day to establish its pattern and its tempo. Behind him, In the space between the north gate and the parking approach, something was happening that he could not see and was not going to look back at. He did not look back. The body was found by a stadium steward 11 minutes after the final whistle. Khalil Mansour, 57, was slumped against the outer wall of the North Gate corridor, in the shadow of a support pillar, in a position that the first responders on scene would later describe as consistent with a man who had felt suddenly unwell and sat down. There was no visible wound. There was no blood. There was nothing on the immediate surface of the scene that announced itself as a crime. It took the Lebanese security services 40 minutes to treat it as one. Those 40 minutes were the margin that the extraction had been built around. Eitan was across the city before the first cordon was established. Raz had exited through the east gate during the second half's 81st minute, consistent with the early exit crowd, and was already in his accommodation before the stadium cleared. Dror crossed the border before midnight. By the time Lebanese investigative authorities began formally treating the death as an assassination, the team was 3 jurisdictions away. This is where the operation's apparent success began to produce its actual costs. The first cost was immediate and operational. The counter-surveillance operative, the unknown individual from Section C whose 4-minute phone call had nearly aborted the entire mission, was in the wind before investigators could establish who he was. His seat in the stadium had been taken under a name that did not match any registered identity in Lebanese police databases. His description, pulled from stadium CCTV, was circulated within 48 hours. It produced nothing useful. But his phone call had not been nothing. Lebanese investigative officials, reviewing communications data in the days following the death, found a signal from a device in the stadium's north section at halftime to a number associated with a Hezbollah security coordination unit. The call's content was not recoverable. Its existence was. This was the piece of information that had been absent from the entire operational picture. The counter-surveillance operative was not, as the planning room had assessed, a personal security addition to Mansour's own arrangements. He was a Hezbollah oversight function, someone tasked not with protecting Mansour, but with monitoring him on behalf of an organization that had its own interest in knowing whether Mansour was under surveillance. The distinction was significant. A personal security addition watches for threats to the principal. A Hezbollah oversight function watches for threats to the network. The phone call at halftime had not been an alert. The post-call behavior, unchanged, unalarmed, confirmed that. The operative had not made the team, but the call had been routine monitoring, and the number it had gone to was now in the investigative record, and that connection between Mansour and Hezbollah's security infrastructure was now documented in a Lebanese police file that would eventually be shared with other services. The operation had, in the process of eliminating a financial node, illuminated part of the network that node was connected to. Whether that was a strategic gain or a strategic cost depended on what the Hezbollah security unit did with the knowledge that one of their monitored assets had been reached. The answer came 9 days later. Within a week of Mansour's death, 2 of his known associates in the Lebanese commercial network, men who had been under passive surveillance as secondary targets, not yet elevated to the priority list, changed their behavior simultaneously. New phones, new meeting locations. One of them transferred a substantial property holding into a family member's name. The other stopped appearing at any of his documented regular locations. The network had not collapsed. It had contracted and rerouted, the way financial networks under pressure always do, shedding exposure and redistributing function across nodes that were less visible. This was not a surprise. It was, in fact, the documented outcome of every high-value financial targeting operation that intelligence agencies had conducted against Hamas and similar organizations over the previous 2 decades. The node was removed. The network adapted. The adaptation sometimes took weeks and sometimes took months, but it consistently happened because the architecture had been designed, over years of operating under exactly this kind of pressure, to survive the loss of any individual component. What had been prevented, concretely, was the specific financial facilitation that Mansour had been providing, the relationships, the established corridors, the trusted intermediaries on both the Iranian and Lebanese ends of the money flow. Those relationships did not automatically transfer. His replacement would spend months rebuilding what he had taken years to construct. Months mattered. In the operational timeline of weapons procurement and delivery, months were not nothing. But they were not victory either. Eitan was debriefed over 3 days at a location that is not part of this account. The unauthorized execution decision was reviewed in detail. The conclusion of that review is not a matter of public record. What is known from the operational literature on close-access missions of this type is that the decision to act without authorization in a moment of viable access, the decision that Eitan made at 3 meters with an unresolved counter-surveillance element behind him and a contracting window in front of him, is the kind of decision that field operatives are simultaneously trained to avoid and trained to make. The training to avoid it says, command structure exists for a reason. Unilateral field decisions introduce variables that cannot be managed from the outside. The individual operative does not have sufficient information to override a coordination architecture that was built to compensate for exactly the limits of individual visibility. The training to make it says, windows close. Both things were true. They remained true simultaneously, without resolution, in the way that the genuine costs of this kind of work tend to resist resolution. Dror filed his operational report. The section on command and communication during the execution phase ran to 11 pages. He did not request a subsequent operational assignment for 4 months. Khalil Mansour was buried in a ceremony attended by men whose names Lebanese security services recorded carefully. His son, Tariq, number 17, did not play in the following Thursday match. The logistics company that had served as a corridor for a decade continued operating under new management, with new accounts and new names on the contracts, names that were not yet in any sanctioned entity list, had not yet appeared in any intelligence file, and were, for now, invisible in exactly the way that Khalil Mansour had once been invisible before a pattern of Thursday evening football matches became the seam that everything unraveled through. The list was updated. New names were added. The work continued, as it always had, in the space between what operations accomplish and what they make inevitable. Hidden Ops covers the documented history of intelligence operations, the decisions, the costs, and the consequences that official accounts rarely include. If this account raised questions worth continuing, the channel is where those questions live. Subscribe and keep watching.